Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today at another Lighting Design Lab webinar online course delivery. Today, we are going to be talking about network lighting controls in healthcare spaces. And it's presented by Shawn Darragh, our Senior Lighting Specialist. Again, hello, everybody. My name is Armando Verdiel, Technical Development Supervisor at Lighting Design Lab. Very happy to have you with us. Next slide, please. Most of you familiar with the rules. I'll try to be quick and easy. Everyone is muted, but you can use the chat to ask us some good questions. Throughout the presentation, there's going to be purposeful pauses to ask questions. There's going to be online polls. We're going to ask you questions, gauge your opinion on things. Please participate and engage. The more you put in on this, the more everyone takes out of the experience. After the class, there's about a 30-second or less survey just letting us know how we did. Please take it. A recording of the class will be on our website and our YouTube channel, as well as a handout of the presentation will be available on the website as well. Any questions, email us at lightingdesignlab@seattle.gov. Next slide, please. As always, Lighting Design Lab is very much a part of and powered by Seattle City Light, Seattle's municipal utility. We are very proud of being the education hub and awareness department for connected lighting technologies. And Lighting Design Lab, great leader for this in the region, in the Pacific Northwest region. Next slide, please. Not forgetting, NEA, the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, on their brand Better Bricks, is sponsoring this webinar. So we want to really give them a big shout out for working with us, looking at what topics, what emerging technology and verticals are of interest to our audience, and working with us to ensure that we make that delivery possible. Next slide, please. And as always, it takes a village. We are part of and powered by Seattle City Light, where we work with many groups in our region and beyond, such as Shaun mentioned today. The image you're looking on the left-hand side is from it's an IES presentation at our lab. We work with energy efficiency organization, utilities, manufacturers, and their representatives, industry, and we work together again to highlight best practices and emerging technologies to our audiences on the right, our trade allies, people who work your retrofits, your ESCOs, implementers, your design allies, your architects, designers, specifiers, and ultimately our end users, facility professionals, and building operators. It is a industry with many moving parts. We are happy to be in the midst of all of this. Next slide, please. We are in the midst of all this, looking to keep our ears to the ground and disseminate the best things we learn to our audiences. We deliver classes, webinars, and education and training as a big part of our service to this region. We also do a good amount of technology evaluation. We do displays, demonstrations, studies, help develop tools and resources like best practice guides and demonstrative videos. And ultimately, I'm going to repeat myself. We keep our ear to the ground and repeat the best things we learn to our audiences as information aggregators. And without further ado, I'm going to leave you off with Shawn Darr, our Senior Lighting Specialist.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for attending. And thank you, Armando, for that great little introduction. I am, as Armando had suggested, a senior lighting specialist here at the Lighting Design Lab. I am, by background, a lighting designer, for those of you who don't know me. I've been a lighting designer for more than 30 years in various facets of the industry. At various times, I have been a lighting control specialist. I've been a theater designer. I've been a day lighting specialist. I've also run several prominent lighting design studios. I'm very happy to be back here at the lab for the last few years. So that'll give you a little bit of a sense about where I come from. I do have a design background. I do have a very visual background. but I also have been working, designing, and teaching lighting controls for most of that 30 years. So I hope to be able to share with you some insights today. This class in particular is a bit of an adjunct to the networked lighting controls fundamentals online class that we taught a couple of months ago, and in fact we'll be teaching again in 2 weeks if you haven't signed up for that, and you would like to have more in-depth information about some of the things we're talking about today. That would be a good thing to talk about. We'll mention that again a little bit later. All right, in the meantime, however, I would like for you folks to tell me a little bit about yourselves. We have a very diverse group. It will help me to understand where some of you are coming from, and hopefully it will help those of you that are here to get a little bit of sense of who is also with you in the audience, and allow me to tailor my remarks to the extent that I can for the next little bit. So if you'd be so kind, on your screens, you should see a quick poll. It says, please let me know what segment of the industry best fits your current employment or background. And please select one. Are you a design ally, an architect, an engineer, lighting designer, a trade ally, contractor, installer, or similar, facility operator, manager, sales professional, of course, including perhaps manufacturers, or do you work for a government or a utility? Just pick the closest one that fits. I'll give you a moment to do that. All right, very good. I am going to close this out, and then I'm going to share with you the results. So today we have, yeah, it's a pretty interesting mix. We've got a good number of designers with us, a good number of contractors, of course, government utility folks, sales professionals. So we have a pretty wide range of folks. If we were together, we would probably spend a little bit of time right now talking about some of your backgrounds with respect to healthcare, but that becomes a little bit challenging in the Zoom format. So we're going to plunge right ahead and move forward into the class. Okay. A little bit about our learning objectives. We will spend a little time talking about common lighting control strategies. We'll review fundamental concepts of network lighting controls. We'll review how the controls may relate to current light and health research, particularly with respect to healthcare. And we'll review some practical application opportunities for some specific kinds of spaces. So again, this is a 2-hour class. It's an overview. I kind of want to set the stage a little bit here. A lot of what we're talking about is modulating lighting within the healthcare space, right? If we were talking about lighting for healthcare, I in the past have typically run full-day seminars for healthcare lighting, and we barely scratched the surface. So we're really going to be focusing on lighting controls here. Okay. So what are we really talking about? You know, healthcare spaces. We think of this idea of healthcare as if it's some kind of monolithic thing, right? But the reality is that there are lots and lots of different types of spaces that we might consider to be healthcare spaces, right? Anything from private practice offices where you might have a doctor with a small clinic office in the medical dental building, for example, through small clinics, multi-care clinics like polyclinic, specialty clinics like, for example, osteopathic clinics or similar, hospitals, hospital campuses, research institutions. There's a lot of different places that we might talk about with respect to healthcare. But the reality is that most of these places, there is a lot of commonality, right? There are very big differences in terms of resources, big differences in terms of patient numbers and staffing numbers, whether we're talking about the polyclinic here in downtown Seattle, or we're talking about perhaps a small rural healthcare facility somewhere outside of a major city. So there are going to be differences. However, there are commonalities with a lot of these spaces. Generally, they're going to have offices, they're going to have conference rooms, corridors, check-in, check-out, procedure rooms, labs, these kinds of spaces. So a lot of the kinds of controls things that we're going to be talking about are fairly universal throughout spaces. And in fact, you might think they're universal throughout other typologies as well. What other places have offices? Well, schools, well, office buildings, well, condo complexes, basically everywhere. So there's a lot of commonality that we can talk about with respect to lighting controls. There are, of course, more specialized areas, right? Patient rooms, and typically when I mean patient rooms, that's an overnight room. Patient corridors, which tend to be the corridors that those patient rooms live on. We might have imaging centers with things like X-ray equipment, or more likely MRI or CT scanners, things of that nature. Infusion therapy is a big one, where we might have things like chemotherapy, or we might be looking at long-term dialysis kind of treatments, basically places you're going to be for a fairly long time. LDRP, labor delivery and recovery centers, pharmacies, surgery places, operatories, things like that. So there are a lot of specialty kinds of spaces that we might find in a lot of these places. However, if we start to kind of try to dissect things and break them down a little bit, we'll notice that there are a lot of trends, right? And some of these aren't really new, I will say. You know, we've had this idea of the traditional healthcare environment, right, where we've got Marcus Welby and everybody's wearing white coats and everything is stark white and, you know, very aseptic. But realistically, more and more healthcare environments have started to merge with the idea of hospitality environments, right? We want to have places, at least for non-emergent care, where people can feel safe and feel happy, right? This is an LDRP room, a labor room in the River's Edge Hospital and Clinic. You'll note it's actually really quite hospitality driven, right? There are, of course, you know, all of the medical gases and things that we would typically expect, but the furnishings, the surroundings, the look and the feel tends to start to approach hospitality. And that's really, really because there's been this push to have patient-centered experiences and a focus on wellness, not just for the wellness of the patients, but also the wellness of the staff, and this whole idea of outcome-based care. I was working on a project, a hospital in Germany, when this really, really hit. The whole outcome-based care jumped into my consciousness. And it really starts to also look at things like this notion of what they're now calling high-value healthcare, right? Where we're looking at the quality of the care and the outcomes and the cost and trying to balance them. In a lot of ways, this starts to look like what we talk about quality lighting, when we start to balance things like energy use, the architecture, the environment, the people needs. So we're really looking at a lot of different things, but the model is really a push away from the kind of imperial doctor model and really more of a collaborative role with the patients, and the patients becoming more engaged with the surroundings. I hope you've all seen this. So there are some very specific concerns with respect to healthcare and healthcare lighting, right? I mentioned wellness, but one of the key parts of this is the notion of the wellness of the staff, particularly shift workers, right? We'll talk a good bit about this a little bit later when we start to notice things like breast cancer incidence by industry, right? 43% of breast cancer patients are associated with healthcare and social assistance. What's that all about? Some of that has to do with shift workers, right? Nurses, doctors tend to work odd hours, tend to be awake at times when we traditionally, as a human species, have not been. And there are implications for that. So let's getting into this. So again, this really is specifically a controls class. We will talk about lighting in certain areas. We will talk about some ideas about lighting, but we'll try to couch them in the specific notion of how that relates to lighting control, how we might think about bringing in particular, networked lighting control or luminaire level lighting control into these kinds of spaces. So to begin with, it seems like everything to do with lighting these days, lighting controls, has to do with three letters, L, E, and D, right? LEDs are, of course, the de facto light source today. Every single thing you might see specified one way or another is based on a light emitting diode. Now that has some major implications for us. In particular, there are a lot of architectural impacts of these things, right? Tiny little fixtures. Get the tiny little bed light that we have here, or the little slot light over the bed that provides some exam light, right? Good efficacy, maybe better color. Key things for us today: flexibility and control, dimming, tunable color. We'll talk about tunable color in a little bit. And maybe some potential confusion, because even though there are fewer light sources, the profusion of different types of LED fixtures and control methods and drivers and all this kind of good stuff can potentially lead to confusion, particularly when we start to look at some of the less expensive or quote value-driven products that may be on the market today. But it is important to understand that this is the driver, right? The fact that we have LED lighting everywhere is really what allows us to have the conversation that we're having today in the way that we're having it. Before LEDs, lighting controls was significantly more expensive. We would still do it in many cases, but not in every case. All right, so let's switch gears for just a little bit here. Network lighting control systems, what are we talking about? What do I mean when I say a networked lighting control system? That can mean a lot of different things. We used to call these things advanced lighting control systems. Essentially, we're talking about anything that has the capability of communicating luminaire to luminaire, with preferably each luminaire having its own address, its own digital address, or small group zones of luminaires having their own digital address, and the capability of being programmed with functionality like daylight control, occupancy vacancy control, things like that, manual dimming, all of these kinds of things. Now, the kinds of systems that really we at the lab talk about when we're talking about network lighting control systems, particularly for the classes that we teach on the hands-on stuff, are these what I would consider to be mid-range network lighting control systems. They're a parts and pieces approach. They may have load controllers and switches, dimmers. They tend to be wireless. They tend to be relatively inexpensive, relatively easy to apply, and most importantly, perhaps from our perspective, they're relatively easy to apply in an existing building. So we can retrofit these systems quite easily. What are some of the characteristics? Well, in the old days, we would think of a lighting control system as having a panel back in a room somewhere in which we would bring either a dedicated feed to that panel, and that panel would have either breakers or dimmers or relays in it, and then we would home run out to our individual light fixture control zones, or we would go ahead and have some kind of similar system that would be through fed from a load center, from a breaker panel, essentially breaker panel to a relay to the luminaires. The systems we're talking about now tend to be distributed systems, right? We might have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 circuits on an entire floor that wind up being daisy chained out from fixture to fixture to fixture, because the control itself is completely divorced from the idea of putting power to the fixture. Now, the fundamental key here is that we wind up having these logical groupings that we call zones of luminaires. They can either be hardwired together with data cable, or they can be wirelessly controlled. There are a lot of different ways that we can wind up doing it. But the fundamental thing is that this really does become a decentralized kind of thing. Some big benefits there. There's a lot less wire. There's a lot less work in installing them. And there's a lot less room taken up in electrical closets. Because we all know that we have plenty of room in electrical closets, right? So why not throw some panels on the wall? We can get away from all that. Okay. Now there's a special subset of this whole idea called the luminaire level lighting controls. And this is the idea that we take all of the kinds of gear that we would normally associate with lighting controls, the dimmer, the load controller, the sensor, daylight sensor, occupancy sensor, etc., and we tie it all together in one neat little package and put it in a box, right? So the idea is it comes from the factory with everything inside. All you wind up doing is throwing it up in the ceiling, putting in three connectors, right? A hot, a neutral, and a ground, and then you're done. Everything else is programming at that point because they typically speak wirelessly to each other. Now, there are some cases where, particularly in healthcare, some healthcare facilities are shy with respect to going ahead and doing wireless controls, and that's understandable. One of the interesting good things about some of the luminaire level lighting control systems is that they actually can also be wired if necessary. Now, another option with some of that stuff is the notion of PoE, power over Ethernet. Armando had just done a nice class a couple of weeks ago about this, about power over Ethernet, and the way that some of these systems get configured and put together. Essentially, the idea is that you have a hub, right? Essentially a switcher, data switcher, that is then connected to the light fixtures via Cat6 cable, one or more light fixtures, whatever your control zoning happens to be. And essentially everything gets connected up via Cat6 low voltage cable. So no conduits necessary, no electricians are necessary if you really want to go that route. It does add some complication. It does add a lot of wire, but it is a dedicated wired system if that is what we're looking for. And it does allow you to do basically everything that we're talking about today with respect to lighting controls. If you want to hear more about the power over Ethernet stuff, go to our webpage and go to the resources, the education tab, and scroll down to the bottom. You'll see a recording of Armando's class from a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so there are a lot of control systems out there that we might talk about. We're not going to talk specifically about anybody's control system today, because the good news is that basically all lighting control systems that we work with at the lab, and most that I've seen, are actually really, really quite robust. There are a lot of commonalities. There are a lot of really good things happening out there in the lighting control world. So these are just a few of the ones that are available. And again, these are some of the ones that you will see if you come to our two-day hands-on class or one-day hands-on class when we were able to meet in person again. But just to give you some idea of some of the level of controls that we're talking about today. The key part to this slide is that we are looking at what I would consider to be mid-range lighting control systems. Every single one of these manufacturers has a big brother system that we might start to look at that is more capable than this sort of mid-range parts and pieces approach. The concepts that we're talking about are scalable up, so you can use those high-level controls, but this is really where we're going today. The bottom line, however, is however we start to think about this, distributed controls today or network lighting controls today, even over what we had available, say 5 or 10 years ago, are tremendously more capable, right? They can do more. The controls that I think of as mid-range today, 10 years ago would have been the cream of the crop. So they're more complicated. At the same time, they're less complicated, right? They're more complicated in that they can do more, but they're less complicated to specify, to install, to program. They're also tremendously less costly. Part of that has to do with the fact that LED luminaires, based on their very nature, essentially any LED luminaire that you're going to get today off the shelf is going to be dimmable at the very least by a 0 to 10 volt control signal. Preferably as we move forward, we'll start getting away from the whole 0 to 10 and start getting into or back into more of the digital kind of driver controls. But however we do it, the idea is that it's tremendously easier and better to pull this together. All right, we are going to pause for just a moment because, you know, I am who I am. So I'm going to have to give you a pop quiz. We're going to have a few of these pop quizzes, and they will be followed by an opportunity to ask questions about what's gone before. We'll do this several times. So if you have questions, please go ahead and be thinking about them. Go ahead and put them in the question bar. And while you're doing that, what are some of the benefits of LLLC, luminaire level lighting control systems? Everything is included in one package. They can work as an integrated facet of a network lighting control system. They simplify design and installation. They simplify energy code documentation, or the all popular, all of the above. Give you about 10 more seconds. Wow, well, that seems clear. All of the above are the benefits, right? It's really handy, particularly when projects are happening quickly. If everything can be included in one package, right? You basically order one SKU from a factory. It comes, you get a pallet full of them, and you start putting them up. One of the best things about modern LLLC, because LLLC is not new. The concept is something that we years ago used to call vertically integrated luminaire systems, which are fantastic, but they always had a separate lighting control system just for those specialty light fixtures. Now, almost every manufacturer offers network lighting control systems that have LLLC capability built into them. So you take the fixtures that most benefit from luminaire level lighting controls, and that's what you do. When you have other fixtures like downlights or sconces or track heads, whatever it happens to be, those get covered by the complementary network lighting control system, and it all works together with one programming hub, one set of wall switches. It's great. They're terrific for design and installation and energy code documentation in many and more everyday energy codes. LLLCs are essentially taken at face value as meeting the energy code, so that really simplifies documentation for those of you that have done energy code documentation. All right, so any questions so far? Really, no questions so far? Wow, all right, fair enough. Then we shall soldier on. Let me hide this. And we'll go back. All right, we're gonna do a quick bit of review. This really is a quick bit of review. Let's talk a little bit about typical lighting control strategies that we use for lighting control systems. None of these are new. These are the same kinds of control strategies that I've been using for 30 years. Right? What is new is how easy some of them are to implement and how inexpensive they are to implement. So let's take a very brief look at some of them, right? Manual switching. Well, walk up to some kind of device, might be a toggle switch with line voltage wire going to it, or it might be some kind of low voltage or even wireless switch that attaches to a relay or a dimmer somewhere, right? Simple, but the concept is you press a button, you do something, lights go on, you do something else, lights go off. Add to that the idea of manual dimming, right, where you have a similar kind of device, but instead of just having lights go on and off, well, you can go ahead and modulate the lighting accordingly. Okay. Add in the idea of multiple control zones into devices, and you wind up having the concept of scene-based control or preset-based control. So this used to be quite complicated, right? You used to have to buy expensive gear like, say, the graphic eye that we have here, and you would spend time programming it, and they were terrific for what they did, but like I say, they were fairly expensive. But starting with the basic idea that we have a networked lighting control system or a luminaire level lighting control system, which basically means every light fixture on your project is going to be controllable and dimmable. If we then simply think differently about those systems, we can go ahead and implement switching, dimming, scene control specifically from the same parts and pieces, and it doesn't cost anymore. The cost for a switch that, we call them wall station or interfaces now, the cost for a button station that will turn lights on and off is not significantly different than the cost of a button station that is going to have dimmable raise lower, is not significantly different than the cost of a button station that is going to have scene control. Let's look for a moment at what some of that might look like. So here, I'm just turning all the lights on this display on and off from a simple wireless device. The wireless device is communicating with all of those load controllers that are riding sidecar to the junction boxes there. Here I am raising and lowering, so effectively I'm doing dimming control on a single zone. So retaining on and off capability. Here I'm doing on and off control capability for all of them, including noting that I have a center button there that is a preset. Then I can also go ahead and raise and lower. The final demonstration there is going to be a 4-button wall station. The bottom button is always off. It's going to have a 3 presets that you can program. So effectively, for no additional cost, just a little bit of programming, we can associate the concepts of scene control that we used to spend a ton of money for with things like graphic eyes and stuff like that, as long as we have the basic control system, the basic dimming already set up, no additional cost. So a couple of other concepts here. Occupancy sensing, of course. You walk into a space, lights go on, walk out of a space, lights go off. One of the things we might want to consider, particularly in healthcare, is that in a lot of places, particularly public places, the lights don't really want to go off. The lights want to dim down to a certain specific level. So for example, toilet rooms or corridors, if places are unoccupied, we might want to have the lights dim down to, say, 20% light output. And then when you walk into the space, it dims back up to whatever space you have. Vacancy sensing is basically the same thing as occupancy sensing. The only difference is that you have to do a positive button push somewhere in order to engage the lighting before it will turn off. Okay. daylight harvesting. Yeah, simple, right? You have photosensors that will modulate the light dimming up, dimming down. We typically would use daylight harvesting in healthcare in places like corridors or reception areas, maybe lobbies, places like this here at the Cleveland Clinic. There was for a time a push to do things like daylight dimming in patient rooms, and I will tell you that's quite complicated, and please don't do it. It's not a great idea. Task tuning and high trim. So we talk about task tuning or setting a high trim as a way to right size the lighting, right? We typically, as designers, will design spaces to a somewhat higher light level than we really want from a target for a lot of different reasons, right? We want to have a little bit of leeway in case finishes change. We want to have additional light so that over time, when lumen depreciation occurs, we can remodulate as necessary. But that means that basically the initial light level in a lot of cases is higher than it needs to be. Now, places in healthcare, one of the biggest places that we can start to do things like task tuning and high trim are places like corridors and waiting rooms and lobbies, these kinds of places, right? And it can save fairly significant amounts of energy. Time scheduling, right? Of course, we would have some level of time scheduling in a lot of different places. We would typically see this in large public areas. Now, there are some newer control strategies that we might be interested in with respect to healthcare. And those all have to do with the capabilities of the LED light sources that we have now, particularly some of the color capabilities of them, right? This is a good example. This is actually an older project now. This is one that was, I think we brought it online, if I remember correctly, in 2012. This is Children's Hospital here in Seattle, ZGF Architects. This particular project was one of the early ones where we tried to really take a hard look at things like circadian lighting. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, we'll talk about that shortly. But we were trying to look at using the ability of LEDs to color tune within their spaces in order to help patients, in order to help shift workers and so forth. At that time, it was actually extraordinarily expensive to go ahead and do that. So we circled back and we really ratcheted back our goals in this particular project. What we have here is an LED strip that is color changing, that is controllable by the patient at the bed. The idea is to give the patient something to have some control over, because this poor kid's going to be here for a long time, potentially. So we want to give them some control over their environment and the ability to have some kind of joy, right? Something to do with themselves and their time. So what are these things kind of moving forward? Well, with color selection, right? We have the ability to go ahead and, particularly in places like children's hospitals, this is a C.S. Mott Children's Hospital, or the Ann and Robert Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago is another great example of this, where in a lot of the public spaces, there are elements of what I would think of elements of discovery or elements of joy, where we can bring in colored light relatively easily with these kinds of systems and these kind of control systems to really make more interesting and engaging environments for people. Right? More importantly, I will tell you, however, is the notion of tunable white. So we think of white light, those of you who have a lighting background here, white light is something that we would call the black body locus or the Planckian locus, or essentially the black body radiator curve. Essentially, it's the idea that we think of white light as having very specific characteristics with respect to how our eyes work and respect to how the basic idea of incandescent lighting would work, since that's kind of been our referent for a long time. Now, we can tune LED light sources to make them cooler or warmer depending on our preferences, while still being within that range of what we consider to be white light. Now we'll see some examples of how this potentially affects our physical endocrine system and our physiology. But the idea is these tunable white systems are meant to do things like affect our mood or alertness, to entrain our circadian systems, potentially for aesthetic reasons as well. Healthcare is one big space that this is important. Another one that people are really starting to look at this kind of stuff is in education, where we're using, again, potentially the color of light in theory to cause people to be more alert, less alert, more calm, less calm, whatever that happens to be. If we add the notion of time of day or scheduling to that, that typically is thought of as something that we call circadian control or circadian lighting. Right? So I'm going to pause for a second because I realized that I didn't say this at the beginning. There are 5 handouts. You can go ahead and look on your control tab for the webinar, and you'll find that there's a handouts tab. You can download this talk as well as 4 other interesting bits of information, one of which is this study measuring light exposure and its effect on sleep and behavior in care center residents. This was done by down at the ACC Care Center, Sacramento, California. I believe PNNL, Pacific Northwest Labs, was a big part of this study. Also, I think SMUD, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, played a part in this as well. This will give you some sense of the notion of modulating color of light in order to start to emulate daylight, right? We know that during the morning, for example, daylight tends to, or sunlight tends to be relatively warm as it glances in across the atmosphere. Noon, it gets cooler. Afternoon, cool. Evening, it gets warm again. So using color as a way to try to help our sleep-wake circadian systems is a big part of, particularly in this case, this is a long-term care center. So take a look at that study. It's really an interesting one. All of this, of course, is made possible by this amazing evolution in hardware, right? From a lighting control standpoint, we started initially with a mad scientist and a knife switch about 150 years ago, maybe a little more than that, but not really much. Today, we're up into the Internet of Things. We'll talk about the Internet of Things as we go forward. But the idea is that along with almost everything else in our lives, we've gone from a predominantly analog existence to a predominantly digital existence, including things like our phones, right? We used to be really happy when we could make a cell phone call and we wouldn't sound like we were in a fishbowl. Now, of course, we expect our phones to be handheld computers. So it's a very, very different world, and lighting control and all building controls have caught up and followed along with that. So we are going to do yet another of the ever popular pop quizzes. And again, if you have questions, please go ahead and pop them in there. So are color tuning and tunable white the same thing? Yes, no, maybe. Why do you want to know? Oh, somebody is sensing a trap here, I can tell. All right, let's go ahead and give you another 5 seconds. All right, so 70% of you think no, color tuning and tunable white are not the same thing. 30% say maybe. The reality is both of those answers are in fact correct. Color tuning, there is a bit of sloppiness in the language that we use sometimes in the lighting industry. A great example is the notion of commissioning versus starting up a lighting control system. Commissioning is a very specific thing. Normally when we say commissioning, what we really mean is startup, right? In this particular case, a lot of times folks, and I do it myself, talk about color tuning when we're really talking about tunable white. Why does that matter? Color tuning typically uses at least 3 different color LED chips, right? So at the very least, some flavor of red, some flavor of green, some flavor of blue, in order to mix to what we would think of as a variety of different colors. In practice, the better systems actually use as many as 7 or more different color chips and mix from there. Tunable white, by contrast, is more commonly a 2 or 3 flavor system of 2 or 3 white light chips, right? A warm, maybe a neutral, and maybe a cool chip. And by modulating the percentage of how much warm versus how much cool, that tells us whether we're going to have a relatively warm or a relatively cool. Another way to express that is a relatively red or a relatively blue light source, right? So are we closer to incandescent, in which case we're going to be relatively red, or are we going to be closer to daylight or sunlight, in which case we're going to be relatively blue? I hope that all makes sense. The thing is, you can effectively manage tunable white with a color tuning system. It's just more complicated and more expensive. So most of the time when we're talking about tunable white or circadian kinds of systems, we're actually talking about those very specific 2 or 3 white light chip systems, right? I hope that all makes sense, because it's important how we start to implement some of these things. All right, let me hide that. All right, a quick little bit here. So why do we use advanced lighting controls, or why do we use network lighting controls? There are a lot of different reasons, and these are the ones that I normally use, at least at the top, for almost every project that I do, right? Adding lighting controls makes places more flexible, and it adds to productivity, right? People are more productive when they are able to control their environment, when they're happier, when they have user satisfaction. Aesthetics, right? Being able to balance the brightnesses within the space and cut glare, if necessary, are very important. Lighting controls can have the side benefit of reducing maintenance by, if we task tune, for example, we go ahead and do what we call underdriving the lamps so that they generate less heat so that the LEDs actually last longer. We might be looking at LEED standards or similar. Of course, energy savings and energy codes are both really important, but those are not necessarily, at least particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where we have relatively low energy costs for electricity. Those are not the drivers. The big drivers are the space uses, the ability to go ahead and improve the physical environment that we have. So healthcare adds 2 very specific topics to this. One is staff wellness, right? We want to make sure that our nurses, our doctors, our orderlies, our housekeeping staff, everybody who is trying to help and take care of us, we want to make sure that they're in good shape as well, particularly in the age of COVID, but even at every time. And patient outcomes, right? We want to make sure that we are creating the best kind of environment that we can for our patients. Okay. So we saw this this slide or part of this slide a little bit earlier, and talking about some of these specific concerns. Now, not every single healthcare facility is going to have shift workers. However, I will suggest that most healthcare workers at some time in their careers will slide through some kind of shift work, right? I don't care if you're a doctor or a nurse, unless you're very, very lucky, at some point you're going to draw the overnight shift. At some point you're going to draw the overnight weekend shifts, whatever those happen to be. My mom was a nurse for a time, and I know that she spent a lot of overnight shifts. So there are some very specific things that really shift workers have issues with, right? Poor sleep quality is probably the least of these problems. Um, Mood issues, metabolism, so it can affect your metabolism. They're at higher potential rates for cardiovascular disease and obesity, and of course, cancer. So in the US and Europe, somewhere between 15 and 20% of all full-time personnel are employed outside of regular work hours. So that basically means more than 7 million Americans are currently working some kind of shift work schedule. And a significant part of that is in the healthcare segment, right? This is why we see slides like this where we look at, for example, breast cancer by industry. 43%, almost half of breast cancer incidence is associated with some flavor of healthcare, right? And in shift workers, breast cancer incidence has been tallied to a 2-to-1 potential incidence. So this is very significant kind of stuff. So how do we start to think about this from a lighting control standpoint? Why am I telling you all this when I keep saying we're talking about lighting controls? Well, let's talk a little bit about light and health. There's an enormous amount of research going on, or I should probably rephrase that. There's never enough lighting research going on. There's never enough funding for proper lighting physiology research. Of the funding that does exist, a large portion of it is really focused currently on light and health and the physiological impacts of light. So things like circadian systems, right? How do we start to entrain our sleep-wake cycle? We'll talk about that in a moment. A lot of stuff going on with respect to aging populations and dementia, particularly with respect to color of light. Behavior modification, we looked at that with respect to the school example of the Tunable White. In fact, there's a great study that had been done with respect to some autistic kids and their behavior at school based on their sleep-wake cycles when they did some behavior modification with respect to lighting, particularly light levels associated with things at night. Blue light hazards, not so much of a big issue at this point anymore, and flicker. Flicker is another one we'll talk briefly about as we jump through. So light has a role in circadian rhythm, right? Everybody has this circadian rhythm kind of thing. The human body is really kind of primed to live on a cycle that is just a bit longer than 24 hours, right? One would think it would be 24 hours, but it actually extends a little bit beyond that. So there are times of the day when your blood pressure is higher or lower. Your capability to think is better or less. Your capability to do physical activity is higher or lower. In fact, there was a thing about this recently with respect to Olympic athletes, where it was suggested that some athletes are able to perform better at different times of the day. And that may have enough impact that you would have the difference between a gold medal and no medal at all, right? So these are significant kind of things. Now, the body clock is regulated by something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's gland, and essentially this regulates the whole sleep-wake cycle, endocrine melatonin serotonin cycle that we go through. So that's all sounds fantastic. What does that have to do with light? So around 2000, a new photoreceptor was discovered in humans, right? There had been some initial research on photoreceptors that had nothing to do with vision in mice in the 1920s. Very interesting work. They discovered that mice without rods and cones still had a pupillary reaction, which seemed unlikely because they had no visual receptors. Well, that research got shelved. And in the early 2000s, we kind of looked at some of that stuff, and a couple of folks, Ignazio Provenzio and Samarhatar and others, were looking at these same kind of questions, and they discovered this whole new kind of light receptor in the eyes. They called them intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. So now we have rods, we have cones, and then we have intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. It just kind of rolls off the tongue. But the idea is that these are the sensors that will look for light and will then interact with the endocrine system, the pineal gland, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus to essentially give us this whole idea of what we call circadian entrainment, right? The idea that in the morning you wake up, serotonin cycle takes over from melatonin. Melatonin is suppressed. During the day, eventually melatonin starts to creep back in, and until it stops being suppressed by this light, sleep pressure keeps building. And I'm wildly simplifying this, but the idea is that we use light, or we can use light, in order to affect positively, hopefully, the human physiology. Now, one key thing about these IPRGCs is that their action spectrum response, or what we think of as the kind of light that will excite them, is a little bit different than the kind of light that excites our rods and cones. So if we look at this, we see that what's shown in the red here is the peak sensitivity of the cones in your eyes, right? That's the color vision in your eyes. So you'll see that that's at that sort of new age fire engine green kind of color. That's the peak sensitivity there. The peak sensitivity for the rods in your eyes, the black and white, dark vision, gray vision, shifts a little bit towards the blue from there. You'll see that in the blue line there. And the peak sensitivity of the IPRGCs shifts even to the blue or to the cooler of that, right? So there are some really interesting implications here. But one of the things to think about is, what color is the noon sky, right? It's a deep blue, right? This is starting to theoretically look for things like visual cues from above to help to tell us whether it's daytime or nighttime. Should we be awake and alert, or should we be getting ready for sleep? Now, all of this has kind of led to this notion that really color of light, color of light, color of light is everything. It's not necessarily true. It might be true. Let me put it that way. So what do we know? Well, the research is ongoing. We don't know everything that there is to know here, right? There are some consensus standards that are being worked on right now. UL has a standard, oddly enough, for day active people. We'll show you an example of that a little bit later. But a lot of this research is still going on, particularly with respect to the health of shift workers and things like that. There's a lot of interest right now. I will say that from my perspective, I'm not a doctor. So I like to think of the lighting Hippocratic oath. I don't want to do any harm. So I'm very careful with respect to how I might approach some of these things from a lighting or lighting design perspective. However, the good news is, from a controls perspective, what we're really talking about here is adding in the ability to modulate light, to do things and potentially modulate color in such a way that we're not doing any potential harm. We're adding the ability to do programming, so we can program our systems the way we think that they should work today. If tomorrow the research says something completely different, we can go ahead and reprogram them. No need to take things out, no need to specifically change things. We just go ahead and reprogram. So how does some of that maybe look? Well, let's look at it. So I've been tossing around this term circadian entrainment, and the idea behind circadian entrainment is this notion that, again, every single day we need to reset our circadian system. This is kind of the way it's set up, so that when you're waking up, you essentially have to start the clock again, right? So if you're a day active person, this is very easy. You get up, you walk outside for 20 minutes, your circadian entrainment is reset, right? Now, if you never get that higher light level, well, you might have some issues. You might need to have brighter light indoors. Right now, I have a great deal of light on me in order to hopefully make myself appear normal in the camera. But most of our built environments indoors really don't provide enough light level or enough light. We'll look at this as something called a dose shortly, in order to really start to do this circadian entrainment. So from the perspective of a day active person, like I say, it's no big deal. I can go outside. I can enjoy some daylight and really wake up. What happens if I'm a shift worker and I don't have that kind of ability? So, and the other thing that really you really kind of look at here is that we really use melatonin. So melatonin and serotonin are two serum things that are within our blood, right? So we think of these melatonin being secreted at a certain point or being suppressed at a certain point. We think of serum melatonin as a marker of how light is being absorbed by the body, right? Light, at least a specific type of light, by these received by these IPRGCs, will suppress melatonin in your blood, right? You can also tell it in your saliva, among other places. So melatonin kind of becomes the marker that we look at. It's not necessarily that melatonin is making you sleepy. It's that melatonin is a signal. It's a switch. Now, why do I mean that? In mice, for example, mice tend to be active at night and resting during the daytime. They have the same serotonin melatonin cycle that we do, but in mice, the melatonin is a trigger to wake up rather than a trigger to go to sleep. So it really is a chemical signal. Okay. So let's make this a little bit practical. How do we start to think about this from a healthcare perspective, or in fact, from pretty much any other perspective, but again, shift worker healthcare? There are theoretically a handful of variables that we really are interested in with respect to circadian entrainment. A lot of this work has been done by folks like Mariana Figueroa at Lighting Research Center, or Bud Brainerd or Stephen Lockley. A lot of different people are doing this kind of research, but it seems like these are the key elements that really go into how we think about dealing with the physiological aspects of light, right? So we have intensity, distribution, spectral power distribution, duration or dose, timing, and photobiological history. Okay, what does that mean? So intensity, right? How much light is going to be striking your eye? And what's important here is where, right? It's really important to know how much light is striking right around this kind of area incident. So if you're looking at a calculation, we're starting to do things like calculating vertical foot candles at this plane in front of your face, wherever that work plane happens to be. Typically, it's about 4 feet off the ground for a seated person. But if you look at this nurse's station at St. John's Hospital, this is a relatively low light level, right? Throughout the space. It's a very calm kind of area. This person is never really receiving what we would consider to be enough light to entrain her circadian system if she is sitting here for long periods of time. So she may need to go and visit the outside if she can, or she may need to find some place that has a much higher light level to go ahead and entrain that, right? So distribution, again, talking about where it is matters. And what's really important is that, again, the light's coming in from above. I've seen some task lights theoretically for, quote, happy lights that are supposed to do all this stuff. They have the light coming in from below, and that doesn't really help you as much as the light that's coming in from above. Okay. Spectral power distribution. So the actual parts of the spectrum that are represented within the wavelengths of within the light beams that we're talking about matter for circadian entrainment. As I showed you, the blue portion of the spectrum weights more heavily than the warm portion of the spectrum, and that is also a little bit complicated and a little bit controversial, because there are some manufacturers out there with light fixtures that theoretically are rich in that portion of the spectrum that are supposed to be helping with some of that circadian entrainment, and that research is ongoing. However, the notion of having the ability to control tunable white really plays into this concept of adjusting spectral power distribution. So, for example, if you want to have more blue light to wake up in the morning, shift your light source to cool. If you want to have a dimmer or I shouldn't say dimmer, if you want to have a warmer light source in the evenings as you're going towards sleep, shift towards the red. Right? Go ahead and make those shifts. Duration. How long are you subjected to the stimulus of the light, and at what intensity, right? This is a big thing. This is an example of a very unusual exam room that actually has a window. Most exam rooms are interior in buildings and don't have windows, don't have the ability to have daylight, don't have the ability to have those higher light levels. Timing. What time are you subjected to the stimulus? It turns out that resetting, for at least for day active people, resetting your circadian entrainment or your circadian rhythms, the best time to do that for a higher light level is in the mornings. Right? That seems pretty obvious, right? That's what we've been evolved for. Now, what about shift workers? What about patients? How do we start to make sure that we are going ahead and putting the timing correctly for them to be able to go ahead and reset our biological clocks, right? And there's also this idea of photobiological history. So we can't just do this every day. There is a time component over time that really starts to look at what are the visual stimuli that we are associated with over time, and how do they start to build up, if you will, right? How do we start to get used to it is a good way to put it, right? And again, for shift workers, this is a big thing. So we've just looked at half a dozen different key variables with respect to photobiological implications. The good news, sort of wrapping this back into lighting controls, is that lighting controls can do all of this stuff. With the exception of the distribution, the lighting controls don't typically change where the light's coming from. For the most part, if we have a networked lighting control system in our healthcare environment, we have the ability to modulate the intensity and potentially the spectral power distribution, right? We're seeing more and more and more manufacturers are really going to this notion of having tunable white light fixtures. If I was a betting man, I would say that in 5 years, every single major manufacturer is going to be standardized to tunable white light fixtures. It just makes sense, right? If they only have to stock one particular SKU rather than 5, right, for different color temperatures, stock one SKU and let the customer figure out what they want in the field. That's actually pretty easy, and it's becoming much cheaper, right? So all of these things become really relatively easy to deal with respect to lighting controls. So this is going to be one of the key reasons that we want to be able to have really, really granular control of lighting in as many or all of the healthcare environments as we possibly can have. Right? Okay. When we talk about non-energy benefits of lighting controls, this is kind of the mother of all non-energy benefits. If we can start to modulate lighting in ways that do things like radically improve the wellness of the staff and improve patient outcomes, that's a huge benefit, right? Okay. Now I'd mentioned the ULRP24480. Now this is a recommended practice and guideline for promoting circadian entrainment with light for day active people. It says here currently in final review, but I don't think so. I think it's been accepted at this point. This document caused a bit of a stir a couple of years ago, or a year ago, at the IES National Conference, in part because UL is not a consensus-based standard agency like the IES or ANSI. So the interesting thing about this is that the people that are behind this, folks like Mark Ray, are really also the same people that are usually behind the IES and the ANSI standards. So in this particular case, until the IES comes through with their own standard, this is not a bad way to look at it. So it considers things like equivalent melanopic lux or circadian stimulus, both of which have been adopted by the Lighting Research Center or the Well Building Standard. Again, we could spend an entire class talking just about these things, but it's worth taking a look. It's a pretty good document. Okay, let's do one more pop quiz, and then we'll talk about some very specific examples of spaces within healthcare. Does timing of high light exposure seem to affect circadian entrainment? Yes, no, maybe. Mainly in the morning, mainly in the evening. This is also a bit of a trick question. I'll give you just another couple of seconds here. Five, four, three, two, one. All right, so 90% of you said yes. Timing of the light exposure does seem to affect circadian entrainment, and that's absolutely true. However, the mainly in the morning or mainly in the evening actually are also potentially true, depending on when you are going to be most active, right? If you are a day active person, yeah, you really want to have that that timing in the morning, right? You want to have that light exposure in the morning. If you are going to be working night shift, you may want to have that predominant exposure when you wake up to go ahead and entrain that system, get that system going. And then you're likely to want to have a relatively high light level while you're working and start to taper that down as you come off your shift. And then when you go back home, which you have the unfortunate side effect of potentially driving home during the bright daylight hours, but once you get home, once you get into your space, you really, really want to radically reduce the amount of light you're exposed to so that your body can shut down and your body can really allow melatonin to take over and allow you to get a decent rest. All right, any questions? Questions? No questions so far. Wow, you guys are a quiet group. All right, let's close that.
Or you explain everything so well, Shawn.
Yeah, I wish that was the case. I do apologize. There are a lot of, because this is specific to healthcare, I'm having to touch a lot of very high level topics that we could dig way deeper into for a relatively short class. But these are all, in my opinion, kind of the rationales about why it's so important to think about lighting controls in healthcare, and why it's so important to, now that we have the ability to dim everything, to go ahead and do it, right? To be able to modulate, to be able to um, add those controls, not just for energy savings, right? It's really, energy savings are great. They're part of the real reason to do these things, but ultimately, it's the most important reasons are for human physiological benefit. Okay, so let's look at some of the typical kinds of spaces that we might find in healthcare environments. They're not going to, this is not exhaustive. They're not going to be all of the spaces. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges or some of the things that we might want to pay attention to, and then what kind of controls we might want to have in here. So almost every medical facility has some kind of lobby, waiting, patient intake facility. This particular one, you'll notice, has tall ceilings, has wall washing in various places, a lot of downlights, a lot of daylight, right? There's a great deal of daylight in this particular space. And there's also clearly some effect lighting in the pilasters there. You can see some of that stuff. So what might we do in here? Well, certainly in some place like this, again, everything that I'm about to talk about is predicated on the notion that one way or another, all of the light fixtures are dimmed, right? In as many cases as possible, I'm assuming that we would want to use luminaire level lighting controls where we can, although that's not necessary. We can also use zone-based controls with load controllers for things like downlights and sconces and these decorative elements here. Even things like troffers if we want to, but troffers, for example, are much better served with luminaire level lighting control stuff. So in this particular case, we'd certainly want to have zone-based load controllers because we'd want to have all of the downlights, all of the LED perimeter lighting, all those things within those spaces. We'd certainly have daylight controls, right? We'd have some scheduling. This is an excellent place to do task tuning, right? To do high-end trim, so that we go ahead and modulate the light to where we want it to be while shaving off as much energy right off the bat as we possibly can. We might also want to start looking at places like tunable white in an environment like this. Although I'll tell you, it's not nearly as important in a space like this that is essentially a transient space, right? The places that if you don't have the option of putting tunable white everywhere, reserve it for some of those places where people tend to spend a lot of time, right? And we would go ahead and do scene-based control here, right? So we would have a variety of scenes modulating the light according to daytime, nighttime, a variety of other things. We would in particular make use of something called adaptive compensation by dimming the lights in this lobby down lower at night for two reasons. One, because we need less light at night based on the whole idea of adaptive compensation, and we would want to have a lowered light level in the spaces so that we would be limiting the amount of light that we would be imparting to people physiologically from a circadian entrainment sort of standpoint. I hope that all kind of makes sense. By the way, again, if some of the terms that I'm using here, this is not a truly basic class. So if some of the terms I'm using here don't seem to be ones that you know, go ahead and sign up for the network lighting controls fundamentals class I'll be teaching in 2 weeks. Okay, what about spaces that live everywhere? So a typical exam room, usually these are 10 by 12, 12 by 14, something like that. And they typically have some kind of seating, some kind of bed, charting facilities, and other stuff, maybe medical gases on the wall, whatever. Sometimes they'll have task lighting like we have here, but most of the time they'll either have two 2x4 troffers or four 2x2 troffers, something like that, right? Now, this is a prime example of some place that is usually way overlighted most of the time. In fact, way overlighted so much that it's uncomfortable for both physicians and patients. I've actually had this conversation with my doctor at the polyclinic. And his take is, yes, he would love to be able to dim the lighting down, a certain amount. Similar conversations actually at my dentist's office in a very similar kind of space. Particularly imagine if you're laying down from the patient's view, laying down on the table there, you're looking up into a light fixture that is really bright. So if there is some way to make the patient more comfortable while also allowing the physician or nurse practitioner to do their jobs, this is a great thing to do. So I typically think that we want to have manual dimming, the ability for people to choose to raise or lower the lighting. Maybe with scene control if you want to. I generally also recommend occupancy sensors in spaces like this with lengthy timeouts. Why? Sometimes people have told me, well, it doesn't make sense to do that in these spaces because maybe somebody's sitting still for a long time. Nobody's going to be sitting still for 30 minutes. I've been to enough medical facilities in my career where these things get turned on and they don't get turned off until the end of the day. Maybe somebody's there, maybe somebody's not there. Kind of depends. But I prefer to do occupancy sensors in them. Task tuning, of course. Now, this is a place where tunable white may be useful, particularly for staff if it is in let's say, a staff pod where they might be in a specific area for a long term. It kind of depends on what your opinion is on the color of the light for circadian entrainment versus the quantity of the light and the dosing. It's a great opportunity for luminaire level lighting controls, right? You put them in there and you're off to the races. No fuss, no muss. You don't wind up having sensors in the ceiling. Simple, simple, simple. Procedure rooms. Procedure rooms are a little bit bigger typically than exam rooms, but these are spaces that wind up having more infection control among others, but also potentially more lighting requirements. So what might you do in a procedure room? Well, you might do an endoscopy, right? Which case they essentially put a scope down your esophagus. You might have a colonoscopy, in which case they put a tube in the other way. You might have a variety of other things. Sometimes in procedure rooms, you might have outpatient surgery. So there are a lot of potential lighting needs. And one of the interesting things about procedure rooms is that today, this might be an endoscopy suite. A year from now, this might be outpatient surgery. Things kind of move around. In a smaller kind of facility, maybe the difference between an endoscopy suite and outpatient surgery is actually today and tomorrow, right? So you want to build in as much flexibility as you possibly can into these places. So preferably flexibility in lighting too. Do things like light the back walls if you can. Provide high light levels for patients when they're required. If you're doing surgery, you're going to want to have a relatively higher light level, but it might be a targeted light level. You see in this example, I mean, this is a swank procedure room. You might see a really nice procedure light like that. One of the really important things about a lot of these places is that you need to have low-end dimming. You need to be able to dim way down so that a doctor who is manipulating a scope and they're looking at a monitor like this. Most of the time, doctors that I've talked to doing these kinds of procedures like really low light levels, and one of the things you want to make sure is that you're not getting flicker at those really low light levels. But you do have an opportunity here for luminaire level lighting control as well, particularly if you're doing just overhead lighting like we have here. If we have wall washing or some kind of more interesting lighting, that would tend to be more of the load controller kind of approach, right? Okay. What about operatories? Start to get into really much more involved kind of spaces, operating theaters. One of the things you'll find if you do much healthcare work, you'll find that I was very surprised by this. Operating suites tend to be very different from hospital to hospital, sometimes from doctor to doctor. Some people like to have really bright light and then targeted light like you see here. Other people like to have relatively dim lighting and the targeted light that you see here. There's a lot of different types out there. I talked to one surgeon at one point who really liked to have the ability to change the color of the light in his operating suite. So there are a lot of different things that you can do here. It's going to be important to make sure, as particularly for you designers out there, to work with the staff at the hospital that you're working with or the medical facility that you're working with to really start to dial this in. What do they really want? Do they want color tuning? Is tunable white sufficient? I think tunable white's probably a good idea. One thing you're going to want to pay attention to in all three of these spaces, the exam, the operatory, and the procedure room, is the color quality of the light, right? You're going to want to make sure that as you're doing color tuning or you're doing tunable white, you're going to want to make sure that the color fidelity remains quite high because you don't want to have somebody suddenly appear blue, for example. If somebody appears blue to the surgeon, that's going to trigger the idea that they're cyanotic, which means that they're having problems with blood flow, and that might become a problem, right? So you want to make people appear as natural as they can while still going ahead and bringing these things in. Now, typically in these kinds of spaces, you're going to be talking about using whatever lighting you're using. It's going to have load controllers associated with it. Luminaire level lighting controls is not a thing here. In fact, there was a story back in Boston years ago. Somebody had designed I think it was at Tufts New England Medical Center. Somebody had designed lighting for an operatory. And they had put occupancy sensors in, which was really, really not a good idea. Please don't put sensors of any kind in the operatory. This is one of those places where you're exempt. But having the ability to do manual control is really useful. Imaging, right? Imaging spaces. So we think of imaging as, let's say, X-ray, and that's a very simple kind of part of that. But then we also think of things like MRI machines, magnetic resonance, or CT, computer tomography kind of systems. So this is a very simplistic look at one of these. I don't know if this is an MRI or a CT scanner. I think it's an MRI. There are very specific requirements with respect to light fixture types around MRIs, for example, and no ferrous materials, things like that. From a controls standpoint, these can be very daunting machines to go into. They trigger claustrophobia for a lot of people. So imagine you're going to be stuck in this tube. It's going to be whirring around you. It's going to be really loud. Is it going to be more calming for you to be able to have the lights dim down in this image very far so that it really starts to get that glare out of your eyes? Or is it going to be better for you to be staring up into very bright lights while all of this chaos is happening around you? Remember, one of the key things that we're looking for here are patient-centered designs. Right? So I would suggest that dimming in particular is really, really, really important in these kind of places, and the ability for the techs to be able to manually dim, because sometimes they're going to need high light levels to clean the spaces, to reset them and all, to go ahead and say put an IV into your arm to put in a contrast dye. But when that's all done, if they can dim it down as the person is coming back, that's a much better thing. Now, these kinds of spaces can also get pretty interesting. This is one that was put in at Mass General Hospital, where again, patient comfort is the key, right? So lots of interest, lots of visual interest, things to pay attention to, other than the fact that you're being stuck into this scary tube. Whether that's the static imagery of the sky and the trees above, or the active imagery of the screen that's there, so that they can actually have active imagery that you can look at. And of course, you've got perimeter color washes and things like that. So you would have some kind of zone controllers, and of course, in this particular case, color tuning to be sure. I would also probably suggest that those panels, particularly if they're backlit panels, having the ability to do tunable white would be really slick in those kinds of spaces for relatively short dollars, right? Okay. Corridors, right? I tend to think of there being a couple of different types of corridors in healthcare spaces. There are the corridors that are essentially for transition, right? You get from point A to point B. And those tend to be the corridors that have things like labs or exam rooms or waiting rooms, places like that on them. And they tend to look an awful lot like this, right? Sometimes they're a little more interesting, sometimes they're a little less interesting. My favorite way to light corridors, for example, is to a continuous band of light down one side and light the walls. But however you do it, this is an excellent opportunity for luminaire level lighting controls. If you put one of these sensor modules into each one of these light fixtures, and you go ahead and set up the dimming schedule such that, let's say you go ahead and set your high trim. Okay, so you right size your lighting, fantastic. You're saving a significant amount of energy and making the corridor less glary, because I gotta tell you, most hospital corridors are pretty overlighted and pretty glary. It's a little scary. So particularly from the perspective of somebody on the gurney as you're being wheeled down the hallway, and every 10 feet you kind of hurt your eyes. Ow, ow, ow. So going ahead and putting in a sensor in each one of those means that particularly on the shoulder hours or evenings, let's say, we don't have the light burning at full. Maybe we dim it down to 20% light output, and as people get near to the luminaires, it dims back up and sequentially on there. So you're never going to full dark. You can always see within that space, but when you don't need the full bright, that's an excellent way to save energy. It's also an excellent way to do a retrofit if you've got a hospital and you want to find a good place to have a quick bang for your buck. Replace your corridor lighting with LLC luminaires. That's about the best kind of bang for the buck you're going to find, right? Okay. So this is one kind of corridor. What about patient corridors? Patient corridors are a little bit more complicated. So, these are the corridors that will have inpatient beds or inpatient rooms associated with them. Now, there are a lot of things to think about here with respect to lighting controls, right? You're going to have some scheduling, but really, what are the issues that you've got to deal with? Well, to be sure, there are medical needs, right? You've got to have enough light to be able to see, to handle cleaning and medical tasks and those sorts of things. But that can happen at specific times. most of the time you're not doing any kind of procedure-based stuff in the corridors. It's really just transition, sometimes charting, but usually there's specific lights for charting at the door stations. Okay, so what is happening in these places? Well, you've got the patient rooms, and then they're punctuated by these nursing stations from time to time. But for the most part, I can tell you, I was in Swedish hospital for a good period of time around Thanksgiving a number of years ago, and I was intimately familiar with it because I designed a lot of the lighting at Swedish hospital, and I was regretting the fact that the lighting in the corridors couldn't dim at night because the door kept, opening up relatively frequently for the nurse to come in. Every time that would happen, the lights would the light would wake me up. And that was unfortunate. So if we could go ahead and dim the lights at night, that would be fantastic. Or if we went ahead and modulated the color of the light to a warmer light at night and a cooler light at the day. Now we have to also then pay attention to things like the nurses, right? So if you're working shift work overnight and you're dimming all the light and you're changing it to warm, that it sort of flies in the face of the notion of circadian entrainment for these folks. So it's really something that needs to be thought of in terms of how do you meet both needs, right? You have the needs of the patients who really need to have rest, and then you have the needs of the staff who really need to have their circadian entrainment met. It's a complicated thing. I will suggest to you that the more granular lighting control you have, and in particular the more granular lighting and color control you have, is potentially going to pay dividends over time. All right, patient rooms themselves. We've already seen this particular patient room. This, of course, is the Children's Hospital at Seattle Children's Hospital. Now, there are a lot of different things you can think about with respect to patient rooms. But one of the things that I really always kind of come back to is the notion that the most important initial aspect is how is the patient going to interact with that room, right? So yes, the medical needs are very important. You need exam light, you need emergency light, all that kind of good stuff. But if this poor girl is going to be here for days, weeks, potentially months, what are the things that we can do to help them, right? So being able to have granular control of the lighting, whether it's the downlight over the bed light, the color light at the wall, having some kind of ability to do scene control or raise lower control is hugely important. Preferably bringing daylight into the space is really important. Daylight and view can be tremendously important with respect to positive patient outcomes, particularly for long-term care. Some things to think about: night lights. If you have, for example, kick lights in the room or kick lights in the bathrooms, you might consider having them color tunable so that during the daytime they are white light, at night they turn very warm or amber, so that you're really not alerting quite so much. You're not keeping patients awake, but you're still allowing them to have some kind of visual acuity within some of that stuff. Also, you want to have manual dimming, particularly at charting stations. If there are charting stations in the room, allow the nurses to be able to modulate the lights so that they're only using the amount of light that they actually need at any given time. At night is probably less than it is during the daytime. Again, to try to disturb the patient as little as possible. Also, you're going to want to think about how you're going to integrate a patient controller into your lighting control system, right? So you're going to have some kind of network lighting control that's going to need to have an input from a bed-mounted device. Usually these are essentially hand units that are tethered to a wall or a bed with a cord, although potentially wireless at this point. All right. So that's a variety of typical kinds of spaces that you might find. There are, of course, lots of other spaces that we could talk about and lots of other details, but from a lighting control standpoint, those are kind of the key facets, right? You really want to think about, in particular, what are the tasks that are going to be done and how are they going to actually happen? And then you're really applying a relatively small set of parts and pieces to the hardware, and it's all programming after that. So let me give you a quick, I think this is our final pop quiz of the day. Let's find out. Is manual dimming potentially beneficial to staff and patients in most healthcare settings? Yes, no, maybe, but it's too costly. All right. I appreciate the fact that 9% of you were honest and said maybe, but it's too costly. So the reality is that manual dimming, or the ability to modulate light within the healthcare environment, is really important in my world, in my opinion. And in the past, it has been very costly. I mentioned the whole Seattle Children's Hospital, when we tried to do a very involved lighting control system, more involved than it really should have been on that particular project, because the technology wasn't really caught up to where the aspirations for the design team and the hospital staff really wanted to be. So it kind of ran into a bit of a technological roadblock. The good news is that technological roadblock no longer exists. The kinds of things that we're talking about are really, really, really easy. In fact, they're the things we do in schools and offices routinely, right? It's a very, very simple thing. So it has been in the past viewed as too costly. I'm going to show you some examples potentially of some things that you can do, particularly for retrofit projects, that may make it less so. But I will tell you that years ago, we used to think of lighting controls of the kind of range that we're talking about here as being somewhere in the $2.50 to $4 a square foot range. Today, most of the time, the kinds of systems that I'm talking about really tend to be more somewhere in the, let's say, 50 to 60 cent to, say, $1 per square foot range. So from those kinds of costs, and these are, again, on big projects here, the kinds of costs that we're talking about are relatively constrained. We're no longer talking about having to pay for fluorescent dimming ballasts, for example. We're no longer having to talk about paying for necessarily extensive rewiring or wiring. A lot of this stuff becomes really simpler. So let's talk about some considerations with respect to things like implementation, since we're talking about cost and things like that. Okay. It's important to think about some of these things, right? Simplicity in your lighting control stations, particularly the things that people touch. You want to make sure that people can understand things really easily. We've got a series of 5 toggle switches on the wall here. Is that easy to understand? Maybe. You flip a switch, something goes on. You flip another switch, something goes on. You flip another switch, something goes on. It's probably going to wind up being better if we have some kind of dimmer there that has some kind of scene control that is labeled, that allows us to understand what they are. Maintenance is important, installation is important. One of the key reasons we talk about LLCs so much is that installing them is really simple. especially when we're talking about recessed lighting. It's a little different potentially with things like pendants, but when we're talking about recessed 1 by 2 by 2 by 4, whatever they happen to be in the ceiling, almost everybody has the ability to do LLC in these kinds of cases. And again, we're really looking at patient outcomes, staff preferences, patient preferences. These things are hugely important. And we can't really get away from the energy savings. We want to have energy savings. We want to be as excellent stewards of the planet as we can, but these are really the key drivers. This, the energy savings, is kind of the icing on the cake. Another key consideration here, calling this commissioning. This is another example, an intentional example of being sloppy with language. When we're starting up or when we're commissioning the systems, one of the most overlooked things that we have in all systems is the occupants. We need to commission the occupants. We need to let the occupants, we need to let these staff people know exactly what is supposed to happen with the lighting control system and why. Why is the lighting changing color subtly from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock at night? Why is the light level dimming at night? Why is there a space that is much brighter for me at night? Why are we doing all of these things? It's important for them to understand because we're doing it for their benefit as well as the benefit for the patients. And so many times we put these systems in. We see this in schools time after time where we put in advanced systems and then people don't know what they're supposed to be doing. And then when things happen automatically, people get cranky and they think things are wrong. So make sure that the people that are working in these spaces understand what is happening and why. And sequence of operations. Somebody's going to need to, once you get these systems together, actually document what they're supposed to do. Are the corridor lights supposed to dim to 20% or 30%? Is the high trim going to be 10% light output or 100% light output? What is going to happen in these things? Are there daylight dimming thresholds? Are there specific color casts? When does that happen? All these things have to be thought about. And very frequently, people kind of get wrapped up in the hardware and the what, and not so much the how. We've been talking about the why. This is the how. Okay. Wireless communications. Most of these systems will actually communicate wirelessly in one way or another. Typically, there is a wired receiver that will be communicating with the driver of the LED luminaire, but it will get a signal wirelessly from a central system, potentially wirelessly from sensors, unless you're doing a luminaire level lighting control system, and potentially from wall devices. You're going to find that there are some healthcare centers that are just fine with that. You're going to find that some are not. The good news is that if you don't want to do wireless communications, almost all of these systems have wired alternatives. This is also a great opportunity for LLC because LLC by its very nature is inherently wired, right? You've got the gear right there. So that is something for you to consider. And if you're going to do wireless, you really need to consider wireless in much the same way, wireless communication, that you would with things like Wi-Fi, right? You've got to really pay attention to things like physical obstacles. If you've got a metal stud wall with chip, it's going to have a very different impact on your wireless communication than you will if you have a concrete wall, for example, that has rebar in it. You're also going to want to really pay attention to wireless communications and cyber security, right? Hospitals have very specific requirements for things like HIPAA, right? For patient privacy, things like that. So one of the things you're absolutely going to want to make sure is that you don't have your lighting control network associated in any way with your corporate LAN so that there is no connection there, right? So that let's say your lighting control did get hacked somehow, it's not going to expose your patient data to any kind of nefarious anything, right? So think about those. Those are some things to think about. The fact is wired networks are also susceptible to hacking in different ways, so some considerations there. Another consideration, this is not specifically lighting controls, but it can be exacerbated by lighting controls, is the idea of flicker, right? All light sources will flicker. Incandescent light will flicker as long as it's if you've got power provided by alternating current, there is some flicker there. You may or may not perceive it, but it's there. So the thing with LEDs in particular is that that flicker can be really noticeable, can be really a problem. So higher frequency drivers tend to eliminate that problem, right? They tend to go beyond what we can actually perceive. But you'll find that particularly some product, when it gets dimmed, will wind up potentially flickering at the low range. So you may want to also set what we call a low trim on some of your stuff as well, so that you can go ahead and have that low trim and eliminate any flicker potential there. And again, if you increase the frequency of the flicker or you reduce the amplitude of the flicker, you wind up reducing its impact. So the best way to avoid perceptible flicker in the healthcare environment is to use the light sources that have a higher frequency. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the future now. So we've talked about lighting controls, some of the fundamentals, some of the ways that we might do these. We've talked about some of the healthcare and physiological implications and so forth. What about some other things that we might think about with respect to the healthcare environment? Well, a big part of this is the letters IoT. I'd said that we'd had the letters LE and D, and those are hugely important. We've also got the letters IoT, Internet of Things. This is a really interesting kind of thing that has taken over in the real world, right? We want to have apparently everything connected to some kind of network so that everything communicates, everything talks together. It all sounds fantastic. I got to tell you, we're not really there yet, but we potentially could be, right? Even things like I was at a conference where somebody told me that confidently they were going to be able to put sensors in my water bottle that would be able to communicate as an Internet of Things to my phone to tell me how warm or cool the water was. My response was, well, I've got some water. I've got an analog sensor that can tell me how warm or how cool it was just fine, right? Just there. So, however, there are some things to consider, right? There are going to be lighting controls are going to interact with room scheduling. They're going to interact with security, audio, video, all of these things. HVAC systems are going to share input from lighting control sensors. This is not hugely new. I've done this on projects in the past. One of the things you're really going to look at is asset tracking, right? So where is the crash cart that is supposed to be in my trauma ward, right? Is that an exam 3 or is that an exam 5? Does that matter? Well, when seconds count, knowing where something is really does help. And the asset tracking function is going to be accomplished by the location of the light fixtures that are up in the ceiling interacting with sensors that are in the particular materials. They might be a crash cart, it might be a wheelchair, it might be a tag on your hand when you check into the hospital to let them know that the person who is having his left kidney taken out is in room 3. And it will also give them a lot of information. It's the left kidney, right? I might also go ahead and still do some analog interventions and take a big Sharpie right on my right kidney, not this one, right on my left kidney, take this one, right? But there are a lot of different things that can happen there. Another thing with respect to this stuff is Li-Fi. So Li-Fi is the notion that we modulate, we flicker light to communicate. So essentially using the air as fiber optic. Now, why does this matter for healthcare? Well, if we're concerned about patient privacy and we're doing charting, there's literally no possibility of anybody hacking into a visible light emission from a ceiling to an electronic chart. So implementing some of this stuff, the key thing here with respect to all these things is that if we're talking about retrofitting in particular, consider using LLC, because you can take existing light fixtures. This is Swedish Hospital. This is a corridor that I did in the mid-90s. I would take those light fixtures out right now, one for one, throw up LLC fixtures up there. I'd improve the lighting quality, and I'd very simply do the lighting control electronically, right? I don't know what that is. And this is just a look at essentially, we're all used to a different look at this from JLL, but this is just a different way to look at the idea that we spend so little money on energy compared to how much we spend on the people that are in the buildings that it really makes the most sense to pay attention to how we are taking care of our staff and our customers rather than worrying so much about upfront costs and things like that. Kind of comes back to the whole non-energy benefits being the most important stuff. Now, note that if you're doing renovations, go ahead and plug into your local utilities, right? Seattle City Light, for example, if you're here in Seattle, Northwest Energy if you're in Montana, wherever that happens to be. They have expertise, they have ways to help you, they might connect you to us. And in particular, they are looking at ways to have investments in energy efficiency, energy effectiveness. You might have some program design considerations, right? You'll actually have the ability to have energy audits, those kinds of things. And some of the utilities are in fact specifically incenting either network lighting control renovations or LLC renovations in ways that can actually help pay for the entire cost, right? It's very, very important. So go ahead and connect out with these people. There are a lot of different types of resources that are available to us. If you go to our webpage, you'll see that we have design guides, best practice guides, and videos with respect to LLC that you can share with your clients. There's a study that is in the handouts that I had given you guys here, late breaking from NIA, with respect to some of the benefits of LLC. You can take a look at that comparison of redesign versus using LLC. There's also some additional resources here that I can put in that some of these are, I could only put 5 handouts into the handout section. Some of these are available there. They're all good resources. Take a look at them. They'll tell you a little bit more about lighting than we could actually go into here today. But there you have it. All right, so any questions? Have you run into, how have you handled personal preference employee accommodations, such as it's too bright, it's too blue, it's too dim, it gives you migraine, etc.? That's a tough question. It's a relatively easier question potentially in office environments, for example, where you basically modulate the light accordingly. In a healthcare environment where people are moving around in large areas, it's a little more challenging. I would tell you, however, that having the ability to modulate the color temperature, modulate the color quality, modulate the brightness or the dimness will give you at least some tools to be able to address some of those questions. I also have found that typically we've been able to go ahead and address those types of things by commissioning the occupant, talking to them, letting them know why things are set up the way they are, and working it through. Take their questions and their feedback seriously and engage with them. Okay. That, I think, is the only question there. So I'm going to hand this back to Armando for the, oh, I'm going to tell you one more thing. If any of this seemed like it was a little bit too much, or you didn't quite understand some of the detailed stuff that I was talking about, I'm teaching fundamentals of network lighting controls, theory and practical applications, 2 consecutive days. In 2 weeks, November 3rd and November 4th. Shortly thereafter, 2 weeks after that, Eric Strandberg will be teaching network lighting controls for warehouses. And 2 weeks after that, Armando will be teaching network lighting controls for schools. Sensing a theme here? You can also find previous courses and our slide deck on online. All right. I may as well do this part too.
Of course.
Go ahead and call us, right? Contact us. We are not at the lab currently, but our phones are still ringing through to us. Our emails are still ringing through. And in particular, take a look at the tabs that we have online. Armando, do you want to take it from there?
Of course, we were almost closing this out. Just wanted to, again, thank the people that have been supporting us, the different utility, industry, and energy efficiency organizations. Obviously, the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance with their Better Bricks brand, not here, but we had their picture in the beginning. But again, they were a heavy sponsor for this delivery. So thanking them very much, and everyone that's been working with us to make these webinar deliveries possible. Next slide, please, Shaun. All right, keeping it quick and easy. That is all, folks. Thank you for being here with us. It was a great educational delivery. Please write to us, answer the survey, and never stop engaging. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Feel free to contact me directly if you have other questions, and I now return you to your busy day. Thank you.